it took 52 years to hear the truth. Not because there were no clues. Not because no one cared. But because the answer was trapped in a time that didn't yet exist. And when it was finally uncovered, it didn't come from a seasoned detective. It didn't come from a confession. It came from patience. From obsession. From someone who refused to let the past stay buried. On the morning of March 18, 1964, in Hazleton, 9-year-old Marise Chiverella woke up like any other child her age. There was nothing unusual about that morning. No tension. No sense of danger. No reason to believe it would be her last. She got ready for school. Gathered her things. Stepped outside. The air was still. Quiet. Hazleton was the kind of town where routines felt safe. Predictable. Protected. Children walked to school alone. Neighbors watched out for each other. Doors weren't always locked. It was a place where people believed nothing truly bad could happen here. Marise began her walk. A short distance. A familiar path. She had done it before, many times. And yet, somewhere along that route, something interrupted that routine. Something, or someone, changed everything. When she didn't arrive at school, it didn't immediately trigger alarm. Children run late. They get distracted. But as time passed, small concerns began to grow into something heavier. Teachers noticed her absence. Friends hadn't seen her. And then, slowly, the realization began to form, this wasn't normal. Back at home, her family started asking questions. Where was she? Who saw her last? Did anyone notice anything unusual? The answers came back the same. No one knew. As the hours stretched on, something shifted. The normal explanations began to fall apart. And in their place, fear took over. By the afternoon, people were searching. By the evening, the entire community knew. A child had disappeared. Search parties formed quickly. Men, women, neighbors, people who had never imagined they'd be part of something like this, spread out across the area. They searched fields. Wooded patches. Roadsides. They called her name again and again. Hoping for a response. Listening for anything. But the silence was overwhelming. No signs of struggle. No clear witnesses. No evidence of what had happened. It was as if she had simply vanished. 2 days later, that silence was broken. Her body was discovered in a wooded area not far from where she lived. Close enough to feel unsettling. Close enough to raise one terrifying question: had the killer been watching all along? The details were difficult to process. She had been sexually assaulted. Murdered. Left there. For the people of Hazleton, this wasn't just a crime. It was a rupture. A break in everything they believed about their town. Because now, there was something they couldn't ignore: someone capable of this had been living among them. Police moved in quickly. The area was secured. Investigators began collecting evidence. Every detail mattered. Every fiber. Every mark. Every item. Among the pieces recovered, was the clothing she had been wearing. Including a jacket. At the time, it was treated like any other piece of evidence. Collected. Bagged. Stored. Important, but not extraordinary. No one standing there that day could have imagined that this single item would hold the identity of the killer for over half a century. Because hidden within that fabric was something science couldn't yet unlock. And so, unknowingly, they sealed away the answer. The investigation began with urgency. Police weren't wasting time. A child had been murdered. And they needed answers. Officers canvassed the entire area. Door to door. Street by street. They spoke to anyone who might have seen something. Neighbors. Shop owners. Drivers passing through. Anyone who had been near the area that morning. At first, there were fragments. Pieces that seemed like they might lead somewhere. Some witnesses claimed they saw a man nearby. Others mentioned unfamiliar cars. A few described movements that felt off. But the problem was consistency. The stories didn't match. Descriptions varied. Timelines overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. And when investigators tried to piece it together, the picture refused to form. Still, they pressed on. Suspects were identified. Men who had been in the area. Men with questionable behavior. Men who raised concern. Each one was questioned. Some cooperated. Some resisted. But in the end, there was one thing missing: proof. No physical evidence tied any of them to the crime. No fingerprints. No reliable eyewitness identification. No confession. And without that, suspicion wasn't enough. This was the limitation of the time. In 1964, forensic science was still developing. Investigators could collect evidence, but they couldn't extract identity from it. The biological material found on the clothing was recognized as important. But it couldn't be traced. Couldn't be compared. Couldn't be used to name a suspect. It was like having a locked door, with no key. Weeks passed. Then months. Leads began to slow. Tips became less frequent. And each new direction ended the same way. Nowhere. As the investigation stretched on, pressure began to build. The community wanted answers. The family needed answers. But the case wasn't moving forward. Eventually, the pace slowed. Resources were redirected. Other cases demanded attention. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, this case began to fade. Files were organized. Evidence was stored. Reports were finalized. And then came the word no one wanted to hear: cold. But cold doesn't mean forgotten. It means waiting. Waiting for a lead. Waiting for a break. Waiting for something to change. For Marisa's family, that waiting never stopped. Every year that passed carried the same question: who did this? Because somewhere out there, the person responsible was living a normal life. Walking freely. Blending in. Maybe they had a family. Maybe they had a job. Maybe they passed people every day who had no idea what they had done. That's what made it harder. Not just the loss, but the silence. The idea that the truth existed, but couldn't be reached. And as time moved forward, something else began to happen. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. Details became less clear. The case wasn't just cold anymore. It was slipping. Slipping into a place where solving it might become impossible. Unless something changed. Unless something new, something powerful, entered the picture. Because the answer had never left. It had never disappeared. It was still there. Locked inside a piece of evidence, waiting. Waiting for a time when science could finally understand what it was trying to say. And when that time came, it wouldn't just reopen the case. It would rewrite everything. For years, nothing moved. The file sat. The evidence remained sealed. The questions stayed unanswered. And then, decades after the murder of Marise Chiverella, science caught up. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic science underwent a transformation. A new tool emerged, one that would change criminal investigations forever. DNA profiling. At its core, DNA profiling is simple in concept, but powerful in execution. Every human carries a unique genetic code. A sequence built from repeating patterns, short tandem repeats, known as STRs. These repeating markers can be measured, compared, and matched. Think of it like a biological barcode. No two people, except identical twins, share the exact same pattern. For investigators, this meant something revolutionary. Biological material left at a crime scene, blood, hair, skin cells, could now be traced back to a specific individual. Cases once considered impossible were suddenly solvable. Old evidence was pulled from storage. Cold cases reopened. And across the country, investigators began re-examining the past. Eventually, the evidence from the Chiverella case was revisited. Carefully. Methodically. With new tools, and renewed hope. The jacket, preserved for decades, became the focus. It had been handled before. Examined. Stored. But now, it would be tested in a completely different way. Technicians began the process. Swabbing areas likely to contain biological material. Extracting DNA. Amplifying it using polymerase chain reaction, PCR. A method that takes tiny fragments of DNA and replicates them millions of times. Enough to analyze. Enough to compare. What they found changed everything. A male DNA profile. For the first time since 1964, there was something concrete. Something real. Not a theory. Not a witness statement. A biological signature left behind by the person responsible. It was a breakthrough. But it wasn't a solution. Because having DNA, and identifying DNA, are two very different things. The profile was entered into databases. Systems like CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. A national repository used by law enforcement. It contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic samples. The expectation was simple: find a match. But when the results came back, there was nothing. No hits. No matches. No known offender connected to the profile. Which meant one thing. The person who left that DNA behind had never been caught. He wasn't in the system. He had no record that linked him to any previous crime, at least none that resulted in DNA collection. And just like that, the breakthrough stalled. Investigators now had the most powerful piece of evidence imaginable, and no one to attach it to. It was like having a name, written in a language no one could read. For years, the DNA profile remained in the system. Waiting. Occasionally rechecked. Compared against new entries. But the result never changed. No match. And slowly, the case drifted again. Not completely forgotten. But paused. Suspended in a strange state, closer to the truth than ever before, and still completely unable to reach it. Because the limitation had shifted. It was no longer about science. It was about connection. They didn't need better technology. They needed a different approach. The next breakthrough didn't come from within the case. It came from outside it. From a completely different investigation. In 2018, a case that had haunted California for decades was finally solved. The identity of the Golden State Killer was revealed. But not through traditional means. Not through fingerprints. Not through eyewitnesses. Through genealogy. Investigators had taken crime scene DNA and uploaded it to a public genealogy database. A place where people submit their DNA to learn about ancestry. Family origins. Genetic connections. The result wasn't a direct match. It was something much more subtle. A relative. From there, investigators built a family tree. Working outward. Mapping relationships. Narrowing down possibilities. Eventually, they identified a suspect. Confirmed it with direct DNA testing. and closed a case that had remained unsolved for over 40 years. That moment changed everything. Because it introduced a new idea: you don't need the suspect in the database. You just need someone related to them. This method became known as forensic genetic genealogy. A fusion of biology and ancestry research. Part science. Part investigation. Part patience. And it opened a door that had never existed before. For cases like the Chiverella murder, this wasn't just promising. It was transformative. But there was a challenge. This process wasn't automated. It wasn't fast. It required manual work. Deep research. Careful reconstruction of family histories. And that's where Eric Schubert entered the picture. He wasn't a detective. He didn't work for law enforcement. He was a college student. Self-taught in genealogy. But what he had was persistence. He volunteered to help. And investigators gave him access to the DNA data, limited, but enough. The first step was uploading the DNA profile to a genealogy database. Not Cody's, but platforms where users share genetic data voluntarily. The goal wasn't to find the suspect directly. It was to find a connection. And eventually, he did. A distant relative. A sixth cousin. To most people, that would seem meaningless. Too far removed to matter. But in genealogy, distance doesn't erase connection. It just makes it harder to trace. From that one match, Schubert began building. He constructed a family tree. Starting with the shared ancestor. Then branching outward. Generation by generation. Parents. Children. Grandchildren. Every branch added complexity. Every name added possibility. The number of individuals grew rapidly. Hundreds. Then thousands. But this wasn't random. It was structured. Calculated. He wasn't just collecting names. He was filtering them. By geography. Who lived near Hazleton in the 1960s? By age. Who would have been old enough in 1964? By gender. Eliminating entire branches. And slowly, the list began to shrink. What started as a vast network of relatives, became a manageable group. Dozens. Then fewer. Each step required verification. Records had to be checked. Birth certificates. Marriage records. Residency data. This wasn't fast work. It took time. Precision. Focus. 2 years passed. 2 years of building. Refining. Eliminating. Until finally, the list narrowed to just a handful of individuals. 4 men. 4 possible identities. 4 lives that intersected with the evidence. And somewhere among them, was the answer. But identifying them wasn't enough. They needed proof. Because after 52 years, only certainty would matter. And one of those names, was about to change everything. 4 names. After 2 years of tracing bloodlines, reconstructing histories, and narrowing possibilities, it had come down to 4. 4 men who could be connected to the DNA. 4 lives that intersected with the past in ways no one had seen before. Investigators studied each one carefully. Where they lived. What they did. How their lives unfolded. Every detail mattered. Because at this stage, they weren't looking for suspicion. They were looking for alignment. Who was in the right place, at the right time, with the right opportunity? One name began to stand out. James Paul Forte. He had lived in the Hazleton area. He would have been in his mid-20s in 1964. Old enough. Physically capable. Present. But there was something else. Something that made the situation more complicated, and more unsettling. He was no longer alive. James Paul Forte had died decades earlier. Which meant there would be no questioning. No interrogation. No chance to hear his version of events. No confession. For some cases, that would have been the end. A strong suspicion, but no way to prove it. But this wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was DNA. And DNA doesn't rely on memory. It doesn't forget. It doesn't change. If Forte was the man who left that genetic trace on the jacket, it could still be proven. Even after death. But confirming that meant taking a step most investigations never reach. Exhumation. The process of reopening a grave. Recovering remains. Extracting DNA directly from bone or preserved tissue. It's not done lightly. It requires legal approval. Family notification. Careful handling. Because it crosses a line. From investigation, into something deeper. But after 52 years, this was the only way forward. Permission was granted. And so, decades after his burial, the grave of James Paul Forte was opened. There's something unsettling about that moment. Not just the act itself, but what it represents. A past that refuses to stay buried. A truth that demands to be uncovered. Forensic teams worked carefully. Extracting samples. Preserving integrity. Ensuring the process was clean. Because everything now depended on this. The DNA recovered from Forte's remains would be compared to the DNA profile taken from the jacket. Two genetic sequences. Separated by decades. If they matched, the case would be solved. If they didn't, everything would fall apart. And so, the waiting began. The results didn't come instantly. They never do. Testing takes time. Verification takes time. And in a case like this, certainty matters more than speed. Every step was checked. Rechecked. Validated. Because after 52 years, there could be no mistake. And then, the answer came back. It was a match. The DNA recovered from James Paul Forte's remains matched the DNA found on the clothing of Marise Chiverella. After more than half a century, the identity of her killer was finally known. James Paul Forte. A man who had lived his life without ever being charged. Without ever being publicly connected to the crime. A man who had moved through the world, unseen. And now, decades after his death, the truth caught up with him. There was no arrest. No trial. No courtroom. No moment where he would be forced to answer for what he had done. But there was something else. Something just as powerful. Truth. For Marisa's family, that truth mattered. Because for 52 years, they had lived with uncertainty. Questions that had no answers. A silence that never went away. Who did this? Why her? How could someone disappear into nothing? And now, they knew. The case was officially closed in 2020. Not because justice had been served in the traditional sense, but because the mystery had been solved. And sometimes, that's the only form of justice time allows. But there's something deeper in this story. Something that lingers long after the case is closed. It's not just about the crime. It's about the waiting. The decades where nothing happened. The years where the evidence sat quietly in storage. The moments where it seemed like the truth might never come. And the realization that the answer was always there. Hidden. Silent. Waiting for the world to catch up. Because in 1964, the technology didn't exist. The methods weren't there. The idea itself wasn't even imaginable. But the evidence didn't change. It remained. Patient. Unmoving. And when the right tools finally arrived, it spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with certainty. And that certainty reached across 52 years, to tell a story that had been waiting to be heard. A story of a child who never made it to school. A family that never stopped searching. And a truth that refused to disappear. Because no matter how much time passes, some evidence doesn't fade. It waits. And eventually, it is found.